Early on in the pandemic, my uncle reached out to members of the family about participating in a regular Zoom call as a way of connecting with one another across the country. Maybe some of you are doing that with your families. So at these family gatherings, different people have been asked to facilitate the conversation, allowing for some structure and focus in our discussion. So when I was asked to lead the conversation, I thought of the occasions when in our Zoom room there were 4 generations present in that one Zoom room at the same time. And so steering the conversation, I put forth the following question. What do you think that you received from the generation before you? What do you think you received from the generation before you? And this is similar to a question I often ask of family members, especially when their parent has died. I pose something like, what do you think you inherited from your mother, father, parent? It's an opportunity to reflect on the person who died, and specifically in relationship with the person who answers the question. Our Torah portion this week, Chayei Sarah, is bookended with funerals. We begin with the death of Sarah and end with the death of Abraham. And in between, Isaac and Rebekah are matched as husband and wife. While the portion begins with the death of Sarah, and we call our portion Chayei Sarah, there's a contrast there. It starts with the death, and yet we call it the life of Sarah. That's so Jewish. It directs us to focus on Sarah's legacy, how she lived her life during her life, and what she passed down to the next generation. And so when we look at the person of Sarah, her personality, we can turn to commentary and midrash to see that it's Rebekah in the next generation, Sarah's would-have-been daughter-in-law, who has the same traits as Sarah. 11th century French rabbi and prolific commentator, Rashi, interprets that when Isaac brought Rebekah into Sarah's tent, and she assumed the likeness of Sarah, his mother, in a sense, she became Sarah. And the commentary says, as long as Sarah was alive, a candle would stay lit from one Erev Shabbat to the next, a blessing would be found in the dough, and a protective cloud would cover the tent. When Sarah died, these things disappeared, and when Rebekah entered, they returned. Ironically, Rebekah didn't grow up with Sarah as a role model, and yet Rebekah seems to possess these similar character traits to Sarah. By Rebekah bringing in these traditions back to the family, she is preserving those spiritual values of Sarah. Interestingly, Sforno, a 15th century Italian rabbi, teaches that Sarah died only after Rebekah, who had been destined to become her replacement on earth, had been born. And he teaches that a righteous person does not die until a replacement has been born for that person. And he bases this on the verse in Ecclesiastes where Solomon says, the sun rises and the sun sets. So Rebekah rose and then Sarah set. Rebekah, according to Sforno, replaced Sarah even before Sarah died, and Rebekah inherited Sarah's spiritual traits. How serendipitous it is to note that this Italian interpretation on this Shabbat, in which we've been blessed to share in the simcha of a baby naming. In Ashkenazic Jewish tradition, we often name a child after deceased relatives, in some ways with the hopes that the child will take on some of the qualities of the person who died. And in Sophie's case, we know that the 4 people that she was named after are beloved people in Shana and Adam's lives, that we hope Sophie will take on some of those qualities of each of those people. At the end of our Torah portion, we also note intangible gifts passed to the next generation. The funeral at the end of our Torah portion is for Abraham, And we learn that Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, come together to bury their father at the cave of Machpelah, the very cave which Abraham had purchased at the beginning of the portion as Sarah's burial site, and which became a place for other family members to be buried upon their death. Isaac and Ishmael inherited the values of kavod hamet, honoring the dead, as well as kibud av va'em, honoring one's parent. By giving their father Abraham a respectful burial, as they had seen Abraham do for Sarah, Isaac and Ishmael embraced both values of honoring the deceased and honoring their father. Looking at later stories in the Torah, we can see how the next generation embraced other of Abraham's traditions. In next week's Torah portion, when Isaac digs anew the wells which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, and which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham's death, Isaac gives them the same names that his father had given them. And in this way, he preserves a certain tradition from the generation before. Isaac also blesses his son Jacob with the words that God uses to bless Abraham at the beginning when God first calls to Abraham. Isaac says to Jacob, "Cursed be they who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you," which is a paraphrase of God's words to Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you and curse him that curses you." While this passing of values and inheriting spiritual blessings seems to be something that passes from parent to child, it need not be that relationship. We saw that Sarah was never Rebekah's daughter-in-law because Sarah had died before Rebekah had ever met her. We learn in the Talmud that one who teaches Torah to a friend's child is to be considered as if they parented that child. Think of the values and other lessons which you've learned from others in your lives, teachers, bosses, counselors, mentors, and more. It circles back to that question asked at the beginning. What do you think that you received from the generation before you? In addition to spiritual gifts, there are also material, tangible gifts passed from one generation to the next. When we turn to the middle section of the Torah portion, we see that Abraham's servant, upon meeting Rebekah's family for the first time, explains to them, "God has greatly blessed my master," referring to Abraham, "and he has become rich, sheep and cattle, silver and gold, slaves, camels and donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore my master a son in her old age, and Abraham has assigned to this son, Isaac, everything he owns." This knowledge of Isaac's material inheritance might serve as an extra incentive for Rebekah's family to allow her to leave her home and become Isaac's wife. Isaac's inheritance of his father's wealth suggests that Rebekah will live a comfortable life. Now, in addition to Abraham giving possessions to Isaac, Abraham also gave gifts to his son Ishmael. We learn later in the portion that Abraham willed all that he owned to Isaac, but to Abraham's sons by concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living. That's an idea. Pass the physical and material gifts to the next generation while we're still living. We can then see the joy it might bring to the next generation. Are there also tangible gifts that you've received from the generation before you? What significance do those items take on? In our home, when I think of and use the Shabbat candlesticks, or etched wine glasses from my grandparents, or the salt shaker that pours way too freely, I call to mind the memories of the people and the conversations when we were pouring the salt. Watch, it flows fast. Physical gifts can also bring out the spiritual gifts. Parshat Chayei Sarah might inspire us to ask, what have you gained from the generation before you? Think about the gifts that we've received, both physical and spiritual. The next question to contemplate is, what are your tangible gifts and intangible gifts that you've either passed down or can still give to the next generation? May we take time over the Shabbat to reflect on these questions as we think of the generations before and after us. What is it that we've received? And what will we give? Shabbat Shalom.